Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I am excited to introduce our guest. Colm Tóibín is the author of a multitude of literary works, which The Guardian describes as audacious, profound, and wonderfully intelligent. His novels, The Blackwater Lightship, The Master, and The Testament of Mary, were shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and Brooklyn was adapted into the popular BAFTA Award-winning film of the same name. He is the recipient of an Irish Pen Award, the International Impact Dublin Literary Award, and is currently the Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. In his wondrous new book, The Magician, Tóibín joins research with imagination to present a fictionalized portrait of legendary German author Thomas Mann and his family amidst the violence and upheaval of the early 20th century Europe. I can only second the sentiments of our friend Richard Ford, who writes, as with everything Colm Tóibín sets his masterful hand, The Magician is a great imaginative achievement, immensely readable, erudite, worldly, and knowing, and fully realized. Colm, it's great to have you back. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody, and I hope the next time we can meet in person. I think any novel deals with public life and private life, and often the balance depends on the novelist or the novel. That if you're setting a novel, for example, in contemporary America, then there are several signifiers, there are several names you would have to include in several battles, political battles that you would have to mention, but you could leave them in the background where the characters could come to the fore, or else you could have these things being of vital importance in some way to the characters' lives. In the case of Thomas Mann, we have a great clash, I think, between the importance of his private life for him and the fact that public life, history, took over and dominated things and dictated how he lived and what he did. He was born in Lübeck in 1875. He was born into a family of serious commercial people. His father was a senator. The family owned ships and warehouses. So that for him, he was the second son in a family of 5. For him, walking on the streets of Lübeck, it's a small city with a small center, everybody would recognize him as being one of the Manns, the son of the senator. And when he was 14 or 15, his father grew ill and his father died. And in his father's will, he said the family business was to be wound up and sold. And so he left a very young widow with these 5 children and with the business over. It had gone back generations and now it was ended. Eventually, Thomas Mann's mother moves to Munich, which is a very big move in the Germany of the early 1890s, from Lübeck, Hanseatic on the Baltic, Protestant, conservative, almost like a city-state, with Hamburg as its capital, rather than, say, Berlin, even though Germany was unified in 1871. It is as though this hasn't fully happened in people's minds. Her move to Munich is considered louche, to say the least, and strange. And Thomas Mann eventually follows her there. And so he has, I think, what is often a gift to a novelist. He has lost a place. He has lost the house of his grandmother. He's lost the family house. He's lost a sense of self-importance that mattered, that went back generations in the streets of Lübeck. And he is a wanderer from now on, really. Even though he will settle in Munich, it's always Lübeck that has been lost. He wrote his first novel in his 20s, a novel called Buddenbrooks, was published when he was 26, finished when he was 25, and it is the story of what has been lost. It is the story of the Buddenbrooks family in Lübeck, going back 3 or 4 generations, but with great emphasis in the second half of the book on his father, Thomas Mann's father, who was a senator, and on his aunt, who is called Tony Buddenbrooks in the novel, and on the boy Hanno, who is a picture of Thomas Mann himself. He has got rid of his 4 siblings, and he is an only child. His mother, I think this is a significant part of his life. His mother was born in Brazil. There was a great trade between Lübeck and Brazil because Lübeck was the place where marzipan was made in Germany. And so the sugar ships came, and there was a lot of, Lübeck people living in Brazil. So that her father was German, but living in Brazil. But her mother was a much more Brazilian mixed blood figure. And she arrived in Lübeck age 7 or 8, and she's educated in German in Lübeck. But nonetheless, she carries with her an exotic aura Thomas Mann's mother. And she married into this staid, stolid commercial family, but she brought something of the South with her into this very sort of northern, overcast landscape. And in the novel, he has her being Dutch rather than Brazilian, but he gives her a great musical talent, and the child Hannah has this musical talent too. The book made him famous in Germany. It was eventually published in translation all over the world, and was cited when he won the Nobel Prize in 1929 as the book, as the one that had made his reputation. He comes to us ambiguously. In other words, he is in his public life a very reserved, buttoned up sort of scholarly figure who makes long speeches. But in his private life, as we know from his diaries, which were published 25 years after his death, he had a secret erotic life. In other words, he was what we would call now a closeted homosexual. But this didn't stop him marrying, and he had 6 children. And so he remains a great sort of respectable figure in Germany. And indeed, when he came to America with the rise of Hitler, when he came in 1938, he is a friend of the president. He stays in the White House. His speeches are attended by large crowds because he represents democracy. He represents the good part of Germany. He represents the future of Germany when Hitler is defeated. And he's someone who comes to matter. But all the time, there's within him a sort of insecurity, a sort of private life that goes against his public image, not just his sexual identity, which is secret, but a sense of him as a much more insecure figure in general than his public persona might suggest. And I want to start by going to the childhood and just reading a small bit where his mother is telling a story at night to her children. Thomas's older brother is called Heinrich, and the 2 girls are called Lula and Carla, and she is talking to them about her life in Brazil. In the evenings, if the senator were at a meeting, or in the time when Thomas and Heinrich, having done their violin practice and eaten their supper, were in their nightclothes, their mother would tell them about the country of her birth. Brazil, a place so vast, she said, that no one knew how many people were there, or what they were like, or what languages they spoke. A country many times the size of Germany, where there was no winter, and never any frost or real cold, and where one river, the Amazon, was more than 10 times longer than the Rhine, and 10 times as wide, with many smaller rivers flowing into it that reach back deep into the forest, with trees higher than trees anywhere else in the world, with people whom no one had ever seen or would see, since they knew the forest as no one else did, and they could hide if an intruder or an outsider came. Tell us about the stars, Heinrich would say. Our house in Paraty, which is a town in Brazil, was on the water, Julia would reply. It was almost part of the water. It was like a boat. And when night came and we could see the stars, they were bright and low in the sky. Here in the north, the stars are high and distant. In Brazil, they are visible. Like the sun during the day, they are small suns themselves, glittering and close to us, especially those of us who live near water. My mother said you could sometimes read a book in the upstairs rooms at night, because the light from the stars against the water was so clear. And you could not sleep unless you fastened the shutters to keep the brightness out. When I was a girl the same age as your sisters, I really believed that all the world was like that. The shock on my first night in Lübeck was that I could not see the stars. They were covered over by clouds. Tell us about this ship. You must go to sleep. Tell us the story of all the sugar. Tommy, you know the story of the sugar, but just a small part again. Well, all the marzipan that is made in Lübeck uses sugar that comes from Brazil. Just as Lübeck is famous for marzipan, Brazil is famous for sugar. So when the good people of Lübeck and their children eat their marzipan on Christmas Eve, little do they know that they're eating a part of Brazil. They're eating sugar that came across the sea just for them. Why don't we make our own sugar? You must ask your father that. And I got that scene by actually being in that place in Brazil. There's a literary festival in that village, in that town called Paraty, which is halfway between Rio and Sao Paulo in Brazil. It's in an inlet. And I went to the house where Julia Mann was born, which is just outside the town, with the Australian novelist Richard Flanagan, who has a house on the sea in the southern hemisphere. And he explained that the stars are lower in that sky, and that the amazing thing of that house on the water, the reason why the shutters were seemed so strong was not against wind or rain, because they didn't have strong winds or rain. What they had were stars at night. What would happen at night would be the stars would glitter against the water and then get reflected up into the house. So you would need to close everything to get any sleep because the room would be so bright. And once I thought of that, I thought that I sort of had the opening of the novel where that idea for Thomas Mann's mother of being in a place that seemed overcast, that seemed dour, that seemed dark, that seemed wintry, and that her stories, for example, were so far away from the lives the Manns were living in this sort of commercial place where their father was a most serious man. This came to me a second time when in 2005, for the first time, I went to see the house that Thomas Mann built in California. That in his exile, a lot of the German exiles found Los Angeles to be the place most hospitable to them. But it wasn't just the good weather, it wasn't just the cheapness of things. It was that it was a city made up of foreigners, that the fact that you were German in Princeton would be noticed by everyone in every store you went into. On the East Coast, being German stood out, but on the West Coast, everyone who arrived in LA was from elsewhere. There were so many people from, for example, from China or from Korea there, as well as people from Mexico, that they felt oddly enough more at home, and they made a little world for themselves, the German exiles, in the years of the war. But Thomas Mann continued to make money. His books sold in America, which meant that he could build a beautiful house in California in 1942, in the middle of the war. And that house is the house where he wrote his novel, Dr. Faustus, dealing with the most sort of German matters, attempting to imagine a time just as Hitler was rising when a German composer would deal with the large questions to do with the meaning of composition and what German music meant and where German music might go, and also the whole demonic, dark, poisonous nature of German culture. And he wrote it in this house. The strange part of the house is, of course, it's beautifully all painted white. It glistens in the sun. The palm trees in the garden, which were there when the Manns came, are so tall and really stately. And the idea of him looking out the window and seeing this extraordinary, he could see the island Santa Catalina from one part of the garden, another part of the garden, you could see the Sierra, but all around were the exotic flowers, the palm trees, and the sense of Californian opulence. And it struck me that this shock for him was the same shock as his mother felt coming the opposite way to Lubeck from Brazil. And his shock was coming from Germany into California. And what's interesting about him is that he's not stable, that we cannot pin him down on most matters, that it isn't merely as though his sexuality is, so to speak, fluid, but that his political position is not stable either. In other words, when the First World War broke out, Thomas Mann became a fiery German. I mean, he became a Prussian. He was militaristic. He was fired up with patriotism. For this most rational man, this most conformist figure, it was absolutely extraordinary to watch him. And of course, we can always see him because he's always writing something. And we can see from articles he wrote and letters he wrote just how much he is part of the sort of intellectual wing of the German war machine. This might seem, oh, well, everyone felt like that in Germany, but that's not true, because his older brother Heinrich did not feel like that and wrote accordingly, saying that there was no such thing as victory in war because the dead were in the battlefields, and that it was about killing people, and that he was not in favor of it, and that he was not going to join the German intellectual support for Prussian militarism or for German paranoia that they were surrounded with, on one side by Russia, on the other side by France, who were enemies Well, Thomas Mann felt this very deeply and suspended his writing of his novel, The Magic Mountain, and got involved in writing a book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, which by any standards is a bad book with a lot of bad thinking. And it's just been reissued. So it's really worth seeing just how crazy a novelist can be under pressures of patriotism and a sort of fired up militarism. And what's interesting is that after the war, in the 1920s, Thomas Mann returned, becomes rational again, becomes a Democrat, and becomes someone who actually, senses the danger that is coming from National Socialism. And from the rise of Hitler. I say senses because, of course, he didn't really see it. I mean, like a lot of people, he just saw Hitler as being a crank at the edge of things. He would dominate parts of the news because of some outrageous statement, or he would be put in prison, but that he didn't see him as being in any way a possible authentic or possible any sort of leader of Germany. He just didn't see that coming. He often doesn't see things coming, and his marriage, I think, is very important here, that it would be very easy to see Thomas Mann's marriage to Katia Pringsheim, who was, she was in her early 20s when they married. He was in his late 20s. He was already a famous novelist, but she was famous in her own way because she was a member of a great, Jewish, assimilated Jews, Bohemian family who were tremendously rich and great party givers. Her brother studied with Mahler. Her father had funded Bayreuth, was a great supporter of Wagner, Wagner's music, and Wagner himself. And so the parties they gave in their house in Munich were amazing. She was the only girl in the family of very talented people. She herself was very talented. She was one of the first women to study science at a university in Germany. Her grandmother was a famous German feminist. In other words, they were outspoken Bohemian people who were serious about culture, and learned from childhood really to have their own thoughts. In other words, that they didn't follow any set of conformist thought or group thought. And she married him. It seems to me that she married him with almost full knowledge about his sexuality. I mean, it wasn't something that would have shocked her. And she had 6 children with him. Their marriage was ostensibly very happy. She went with him everywhere. They became great companions, and she wrote a wonderful book at the end of her life called Unwritten Memories, where she described her life with him, including the fact that in 1911 she went to Venice with him. And she says in the book, yes, Tommy, he wrote Death in Venice about seeing a beautiful boy. His protagonist sees a beautiful boy on the beach. Well, she said, Tommy, yes, he did it. There was a beautiful boy there, a Polish boy, and Tommy could not stop looking at him. And she says this in a way that she was amused by, that it was another interesting aspect of her husband, rather than something that shocked her or depressed her or demeaned her, that she seemed equal to it. And towards the end of his life, when he falls in love really weirdly, I mean, it's a weird episode, but he does genuinely, because we know from his diaries, he falls deeply in love with a waiter in a Swiss hotel. And Katia watches this with amusement and arranges further meetings for him with the waiter, so that because he's depressed, meeting the waiter will depress him less. I mean, we'll cheer him up a bit. So that it's a complex relationship. And they have these 6 children, all of whom are very talented. I think what happens in Germany is that after the First World War, there were so many orders given and the defeat was so enormous that parents just stopped ordering their children around. That whole business of discipline of the one generation telling the next, making rules for the next generation, just was abandoned, so that young German people in the 1920s did as they pleased, or great numbers of them did. And among the great numbers, I mean, really, as leaders of this great numbers were Thomas Mann's 2 eldest children, Erika Mann and Klaus Mann. Erika was an actress, a feminist. She was lesbian. It didn't stop her marrying briefly, but nonetheless, she was mainly lesbian. Later on, she will marry W.H. Auden in order to get a visa, so that she can get a British passport. Auden, who's homosexual, is happy to oblige her in that way. And she'll be photographed all the time. She's always in magazines, writing for magazines or articles about her in magazines. And this happens to her from her late teens onwards. And it happens even more to her brother Klaus, who writes plays, which him and his sister act in. and writes novels and is outspoken, is also homosexual, and he becomes interested in morphine and various drugs. And these are the two eldest children of these 6 children, others of whom go on to do things too. So that this is, there's a sense sometimes that Thomas Mann is a ghost of his own life. In other words, that he's in the study in the morning writing his novels. He comes to lunch to find this outrageously outspoken family having an argument about something in which he's just interrupted if he speaks. I mean, they just push him aside. They call him the magician because he told them he did magic tricks, but he told Klaus that he was a magician when Klaus was having nightmares, and he could banish the nightmares as a magician. But he's not a magician at the table. At the table, he's just the dull old father of these brilliant and glittering children. And so they end up in a way dominating his life and taking over his life. Once Hitler comes to power, the Manns are out of, he's on a book tour or a lecture tour, and his children are in Munich, and they warn him, don't come back in. It's not safe for you to come back in to Germany. He's won the Nobel Prize 4 years earlier, so he's seen as a sort of dominant figure in a German culture that has now realized that Hitler is the most dangerous person, but it's too late. Hitler is in power. And he stays in Switzerland. He goes to France for a while. He goes back to Switzerland, and eventually it's absolutely clear to him and his wife that the only place they can go where they will be safe is America. And he's looked after in America by a woman called Agnes Mayer, who's the mother of Catherine Graham, and whose husband owns the Washington Post. So she's a very powerful figure in Washington, and with German parents. And she has she studied at Barnard, and she has a great interest in Thomas Mann as a sort of genius. And she introduces him to the president, who realizes that this is someone he can trust. Roosevelt and Thomas Mann become friends. And what they don't want is Thomas Mann to go around America saying America must enter the war. That they realize they will enter the war eventually, but they don't want pressure, because there are people in Congress who don't want them to enter the war. And among the population, there are many Americans who don't want to be involved in the war. And so it's one of those situations which is a very American moment, where the president wants one thing, Congress wants another, and they're very worried about, about half the population. So that sort of gap that is so American. I mean, if you're an outsider, it seems so much part of American life is happening. And the president wants Thomas Mann on side. He doesn't want him to become a sort of strange opposition, demanding that America would come and defeat Hitler. So the Manns, this particular passage is in 1942, and the Manns, are in Washington. They're going to see the president, but the night before they're seeing the president, Agnes Mayer gives a dinner for them. And at the dinner, she invites various luminaries, including a famous journalist who might be someone like, if it was now, would be more endowed. She invites a sort of right-wing senator. There are many of those. We don't have to imagine who that would be, to be at the dinner so Thomas Mann can see a sort of, and she invites a poet, and she invites also someone from the State Department. And and she wants to have a sort of controversial dinner where they can all discuss the matters of the day. The senator doesn't want any involvement of America in anything outside its own borders. He thinks the first American involvement in the First World War was a mistake. He said, we just don't have a dog in the European fight, and we're not to get involved. And this is Agnes Mayer really trying to cause trouble at the table. She says, I often ask myself, if the war could not have been prevented, am I not alone in that? I mean, by true vision, when the clouds showed signs of darkening, the senator signaled to the waiter that he would like a second helping of the soup. He had tucked his napkin into the neck of his shirt. He made a single loud sound, a clear warning that he had something emphatic to say, then spooned some soup into his mouth. Having swallowed it, he looked up at the table. The table waiting for him to speak. We did ourselves no good over there in the last war, he said, and we will do ourselves no good over there now. It's not our dogfight. We have our own struggle, especially against that awful woman being Eleanor Roosevelt. She will bring the country down. The man from the State Department glanced at Thomas, who tried to look as though he did not understand that the senator was referring to Eleanor Roosevelt. She does nothing but good, the columnist said. As the second course was served, Agnes attempted to find other topics that might create controversy at the table. But even the senator and the columnist, who seemed to know each other well, were tired of sparring. Eugene, who's the editor of the Washington Post, did not speak at all. The poet also stayed silent. His wife several times, when there was a gap in the conversation, mentioned the name of one of Thomas's books and went into a kind of swoon. They did not merely change my life, she said. They taught me how to live. Agnes Mayer wants none of this sort of talk. She wants to go back to politics. After the war, of course, Agnes said, there will have to be huge investment in Germany. That's when America will have to spend money, real money. I do not think that that would be desirable or possible, Katia said. Now, Katia is Thomas's wife, and she hasn't spoken yet at this dinner, suddenly interjects here. And Agnes Mayer just immediately decides to patronize her. Well, it will certainly be possible, and I believe it will be desirable, she says. And yes, I agree, the columnist says, from the rubble, something will emerge, and all I hope with America's help. I've heard enough, the senator said. Where I live, no one wants to give a cent to Germans at peace or at war. It's not our war, and there's no guarantee we will win it. But of course a new Germany will have to be created, Agnes said, ignoring the senator. And we may even have someone in the company who will be the first president of a new Germany, because that was being discussed at the time, that Thomas Mann would be the first president of a defeated Germany. And then Katia interrupts again. We do not want Germany to be built again, Katia said. Why not, my dear, Agnes said, again, being patronizing, which is patronizing the wrong person. Katia is in a rage, and this debate is going on among all the German exiles. What will happen to Germany if Hitler is defeated? What sort of country will it be? How could you make sure it will not rise again to become militaristic? What was in the German spirit that caused so much support for Hitler? And this is Katia. The German people voted for Hitler, Katia said, and the thugs around him. They're supporting the Nazis. They oversee the cruelty. It is not simply that there is a group of barbarians at the top. The whole country, and Austria too, is barbarous. And the barbarity is not new. The anti-Semitism is not new. It is part of Germany. Well, what about Goethe, Schiller, Bach, Beethoven, Agnes asked. That is what disgusts me, Katia said. The Nazi leaders listen to the same music as we do, look at the same paintings, read the same poetry. But it makes them feel that they represent some higher civilization. And that means no one is safe from them, least of all the Jews. But surely the Jews, the poet started to say. Don't tell me about the Jews, if you don't mind, Katia interrupted. I wasn't aware that you yourself, Agnes began, meaning you yourself were Jewish. Were you not, Mrs. Mayer? Katia again cut in. Thomas had never seen his wife become heated like this in the company of strangers, nor had he ever heard her claim her own Jewishness in public in such an open and defiant way. Her English was more fluent than normal. Her command of the language suggested that she'd actually prepared what she was going to say. And he noticed the man from the State Department, who's called Alan Bird, fixing his attention on Katia as Agnes asked her, in the event of an Allied victory, what might be done with the defeated Germany? Suppress it, Katia said. The very thought of it makes me shiver. But will you and your husband not return there if Germany is defeated? Alan Bird from the State Department asked. The war will never be over for us, Katia said. We will never live in Germany again. The idea of mingling with Germans who complied, who stood quietly by or who took part is horrifying. But aren't you German as much as they are? The thought I might have been German ever fills me with shame. But do you not feel, Agnes began. I feel pity for my parents, Katia interrupted. That is what I feel. Everything they owned taken from them, reduced to paupers, their children all fled. My father was stripped naked at the Swiss border. They were lucky. They had old friends who helped them, including a rich Swiss family who rescued them. And the conversation goes on. And that is the sort of debate that's happening both in Washington and in Los Angeles about what to do with Germany if Hitler is defeated. When the problem Thomas Mann has, of course, is that when he gets to America, it's absolutely clear that he will be protected by America and be treated in a way with great respect in America. But what he has to do, and he does with Agnes Mayer's help, is to get his 6 children into America, which is not an easy task in those years, to get his brother Heinrich and Heinrich's second wife to America. And so for those 3 years, say from 38 to 41, his job is to just get all of them one by one out. His daughter Monica, she crosses on a ship that's going to Toronto or that's going to Canada, the Isle of Benares, and her husband, the ship is torpedoed, and her husband is drowned in front of her, and she holds onto a plank. She's on the ocean for a whole night. So it isn't as though any of this is ever easy. His son Klaus gets involved in the American Army. His son Golo works in intelligence for the Americans. Because Erica has a British passport for marriage to Orden, she too can get involved in the war on the British side as a journalist. And of course, at the end of the war, she gets to interview the Nazi leaders who are being held in Nuremberg. Klaus goes back to the old family house, which was used as some sort of brothel in the war, and it's destroyed. And the whole question then becomes, will this great writer return to his own country, where he's needed now more than ever? Thomas Mann must come back to Germany. And the Manns are in California, and he is working on his novel, Dr. Faustus, and they have no intention of living in Germany again. And Klaus warns him, do not take a political job. You will be assassinated. I mean, it's just not, Germany is not stable enough for someone like you to return. But also, nobody wants the exiles who have been sunning themselves in California to suddenly come back as heroes into a Germany that has, from its own view, really suffered in the war. In other words, ordinary people even people who were compliant with the rise of Hitler, suddenly found that compliance was a disaster for them and their families. And so by the end of the war, they feel not only defeated, but oddly victimized, which is a strange idea if you come from outside Germany. But that was a feeling people had been, with the extraordinary bombing of the cities, people starving. And so by the end, by 45, 46, they don't want outsiders to come in. The effort to rebuild the country will be slow, will be done with American money, but it will be done by people who were in Germany during the war. Of course, this will be for Thomas Mann a really difficult idea, that when he does go back in 1949, he's shaking hands with people, and he just says to someone, God only knows what amount of blood were on the hands I'm shaking. He goes back to Munich to find that it isn't as though a young new generation has taken over who had no truck with the Nazis. It is other people, I mean, middle-aged people, people who were around for the rise of Hitler, are in power in Germany in a way that really, really makes him sick. But nothing comes simple. The Americans don't want him to go into the Eastern Zone. Germany is being divided, and the Eastern Zone will belong effectively to the Soviet Union, and the Western Zone is essentially being run by Britain and France, and especially the United States. And when Mann comes back to Germany, the Americans are absolutely emphatic. That same man from the State Department meets him and says, "We do not want you to go in to the Eastern Zone." And Thomas Mann, in a mixture of sort of innocence and naivety, says, "Well, I live in the language. That is where I'm from. I'm from the language, and the language is not divided. There's no East-West in language." And the diplomat says to him, "Don't be naive. If you go into the East, they will use your presence as a propaganda." And Mann points out, "Well, is my presence in the West not propaganda?" The man said, "Yes, it is." And that, in other words, you have been treated so well by America. Surely you understand. You cannot betray us now, just when you can. And Mann realizes that if he does do what the Americans want, he will be seen as a stooge. He'll be seen as somebody who gave in to American influence and American power. And so he goes into the East, and he makes a speech in Weimar, and that is seen by the Americans as being a sort of treachery. So when he goes back to America, it is a sort of cold house for him. It's the rise of the McCarthy period, and he's seen as someone who is even mentioned, which is really, really funny, or I mean, ironic, as a communist and as somebody who cannot be trusted politically. I think he is someone who cannot be trusted politically, but coming from a conformist, a conservative point of view, rather than from the left. I think his daughter Erica was much more left-wing than he was. His brother Heinrich was more left-wing than he was. But in any case, in 1952, he decides it's time to sell the house, the beautiful house in Pacific Palisades, and take himself out of America and go to Switzerland. What's interesting is what he does now is that he's in his late 70s. He realizes he probably has one more book to do. And he goes back to a story he wrote 40 years earlier called Felix Krull, which is the story of a con man, of someone who cannot be trusted, of a sort of interloper. It's called Felix Krull, Confidence Man. And he decides he will write this novel at the end of his life. And this novel really shows the sort of comic side of life, even at things that had happened to Thomas Mann that were serious. He makes them into a sort of joke at the end. And it is, I suppose, an effort to show what has been there from the beginning, that within his heaviness, within his sort of stolid Germanness, there is a comic side, there is a light side. If you look at Buddenbrooks, the antics of the aunt figure, the Tony Buddenbrooks, who gets married a number of times and seems sort of flighty, and is one of the great sort of personalities in the book. But there is a lightness in that book, in the way character is treated, even in the way big historical moments are treated, even in the way the decline of the family is treated, as well as, of course, a sense of tragedy, a sense of impending doom. But the two are mixed. At the end of his life, he doesn't do the impending doom. He does the jokiness. He portrays the human as a character who's constantly trying to seem plausible, and that the constant need for self-invention, for wearing masks, for becoming someone other than you were, which of course is something Thomas Mann has done in his own life, from being a fired up sort of Prussian militarist to being an opposition to Hitler, to being an opposition to Hitler who really wasn't very brave at the beginning, to being a figure once he arrived in America who was seen as a great leader, as a great Democrat. I mean, much of the amusement of those who had watched him being timid in a previous period, so that he too in his own way has been a confidence man and a con man. But back in Germany, he goes back to Lübeck, and of course Lübeck has been really badly bombed in the war. And of course, from America, he saw that as being a part of the war effort, that that Germany had to be defeated, and that bombing its major commercial centers was one way of doing that. But of course, when he goes back to Lübeck, those are large geopolitical questions really mean nothing compared to the level of destruction. And among the things destroyed was the grave of a composer called Buxtehude. And Buxtehude was a famous organist in the late early 18th century. And he, among the things that happened that make Buxtehude so famous is that Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, walked across Germany in order to meet Buxtehude and see him playing the organ and learn from him. And so this is at the very end of the book, when he remembers back to his mother, and his mother, in the bombing, the grave of Buxtehude has been completely destroyed, smithereens, dust. So the very idea of the bombing actually going underground into where the dead lay is something that's been on his mind. And he remembers a story about Buxtehude's daughter that his mother told. And each year, she said, when young organists came, including Handel himself, to learn the secrets of his trade from the famous organist Buxtehude, Buxtehude promised each one that he would tell him enough to make him the greatest composer in the world if he agreed to marry his daughter. But even though his daughter was beautiful and accomplished, all the visitors refused, since all of them had romantic commitments at home, and therefore they left without learning the secret from the organist. And then, as a suitor was finally found for his daughter, a suitor with no interest in music, Buxtehude was afraid that he would die and the secret would be lost to the world. Little did he know that a very young composer in Arnstadt had heard about him and had decided to walk all the way to Lübeck to see if he could discover the secret. The young composer's name was Johann Sebastian Bach. And he walked to Lübeck through wind and rain. Often he could find no boarding house and had to sleep in haystacks or in fields. Often he was hungry. Very often he was cold. But he was always sure of his purpose. If he could get to Lübeck, he would meet a man who would help him to become a great composer. This is his mother talking and the children all listening. Buxtehude was almost in despair. Some days he really believed that his sacred knowledge would be buried with him. On other days, in his heart, he knew that someone would come, and he dreamed that he would recognize the man immediately. He would take him to the church and he would share his secrets with him. How would he recognize the man, Thomas asked. The man would have light in his eyes or something special in his voice, Thomas's mother said. How could he be sure, Thomas asked. Wait, he's still on his journey. He's worried. Every day the walk seemed longer. He's told the man he works for that he will be away only a short time. He does not realize how far Lübeck is, but he does not turn back. He walks on and on, asking all the time how far Lübeck is. But it is so far that some people he meets have never even heard of Lübeck. But eventually he arrives in Lübeck. And when he asks for Buxtehude, he is told that he will be in the Marienkirche, practicing the organ. And as soon as Bach steps into the church, Buxtehude senses that he's no longer alone. He stops playing and looks down from the gallery and sees Bach. And behind him he sees the light Bach has carried with him all the way, something glowing in his spirit. And he knows that this is the man to whom he can tell the secret. But what is the secret? Thomas asked. If I tell you, will you promise to go to bed? Yes. It is called beauty, his mother said. The secret is called beauty. He told him not to be afraid to put beauty into his music. And then for weeks and weeks and weeks, Buxtehude showed him how to do this. Thank you.
Oh my, that was really wonderful. I don't see any point of asking questions, but we'll do it because it's what we do. Thank you so much, Colm, for that beautifully framed reading and the discussion of Mann's life. You were focusing on music at the end, and it seems so important to both you and Mann. And I wonder if you could talk about how Mann used music in his work, how you used it in this novel, and how you find rhythms that you need to hold on to in order to make sentences work.
In Mann, he uses it really early. In Buddenbrooks, the Buddenbrooks family are old commercial people. They have no interest in music. But when the senator marries the exotic woman from Amsterdam, Gerda, she comes with music. She brings music in. And with music, she brings, I think, instability, a sort of yearning in the soul that the Buddenbrooks are not used to. That it makes its way into many things in the family. So that Mann, yes, I mean, he has very little to say about painting, for example, in his work and in his letters. But all the time he's paying attention to music. He's overwhelmed by Wagner, as so many people were in those years. People still are, but I mean, in the Germany of those years, he's overwhelmed as a young man by Wagner. And we notice him as soon as records, as soon as recordings become available, he's writing about that. Obviously, it's in a lot of the short stories. There's a wonderful moment in the Magic Mountain where they get a record player up into the Davos, into the sanatorium in the Swiss, and they're doing the Ouija board and they're attempting to make contact with the dead, and they put on this song from Gounod's Faust, which is Valentine's Prayer, Avant de quitter ce lieu, and that becomes so powerful that Hans Castorp's cousin comes back from the dead and appears in the corner of the room. I find it one of the most moving sequences where music has this sort of magic power. And then he brings it much further. In this house in California in the 1940s, he writes the story of the composer Adrian Leverkühn, the German composer, and it's set in the 1920s or before the war. But this composer is there are long lectures on various things in music, including Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, Beethoven's Piano Sonata, Opus 111, Opus 132, where he goes into the technical things because he is going to base Adrian Leverkusen's adventures in music and his innovations. Is going to connect them to those of Schoenberg, who is living nearby in California. This most severe German composer is living just down the road. They meet at parties, and Mann is fascinated by him because he has invented this 12-tone system. He has changed the whole way German music, or classical music in general, is done. I mean, Mann realizes that this is the one. It's almost as though there's no one in literature except Kafka who approaches this. And he uses various aspects of Schoenberg, to Schoenberg's consternation when the book appears, in the making of his demonic figure, Adrian Leverkusen. So yeah, music goes right through. And of course, his son, Michael, is a viola player, which means that Michael's always got a string quartet on the go. And he can have them, you know, he can ask them to play things. And of course, as the technology gets better, he buys more and more records. And you have him, you know, always in the evening listening to Brahms or listening to Beethoven. And his problem is, of course, that Hitler was fired up by the same Wagner music as he was fired up by. And he thinks about this a lot and writes a famous essay called Hitler, Our Brother, meaning that Hitler is a failed artist, that we have to be, you know, it isn't merely that this barbarian arose. It was this barbarian arose from the same culture as I arose. And so, yeah, music, and of course, you know, in the years of inflation, we have images of Thomas Mann and his wife coming down the stairs of the Munich Opera House with their, you know, their chauffeur waiting for them, with Thomas Mann, with his wife's fur coat, with their beautiful car, one of their several cars outside. This is in the years of real poverty and inflation. And I have an image where, you know, he wonders, could Hitler have been in the crowd one of those nights where, you know, someone who couldn't afford to get into the opera? This is, I'm talking about like 1922, 23. Could Hitler have one of those nights? You know, that level of hatred of the Munich bourgeoisie, some of whom, of course, were Jewish. And music is absolutely vital in the way he writes and the way he makes images and the way he makes pattern. And yes, I think anyone, I mean, I listen to a lot of music and I listen to the same, I mean, nothing is, it's funny about someone who's addicted to classical music. Someone said, like, have you not moved ever beyond like 1900 in your music? Like, imagine if that was true with your electrical appliances or any other aspect of even the laws that you live under. But you're stuck with this business of, you know, Sibelius and Brahms being the sort of end of where you go, but you're really most at home when, you know, Bach to Beethoven, and it's absolutely true. And of course, if you pay attention to Wagner, that whole idea of pattern, that whole idea of nuance, you know, a tiny few notes signaling an emotion or a person or reminding you of something. And I think that, you know, yes, that writing has this musical element in that the reader reads silently and you write silently and you write for silent reading. But oddly enough, silent reading has its own noise. It has its own rhythms, in that if a book is dead rhythmically, the reader will not want to turn the page. But it's the rhythms that hold the attention as much as any set of actions. And so you're working with some strange idea of music that's underneath the in between the words, or this undercurrent in a work of prose.
How do you know you've heard it when it's silent and it's?
If you can't judge that, you should go to law school. You know, in other words, that you know, that if you cannot tell the difference between, for example, a judgment, you know, a Supreme Court judgment, and a novel by Saul Bellow, I can't help you. You know, in other words, just think about that. You know, in other words, think of what Marilyn Robinson does in one of her novels, and think about you know, a long non-fiction book describing or a biography, and you realize that Marilyn Robinson is working with rhythm, and it's not merely what her book's about. It is some sense. I suppose it's a sort of elegance, but it needn't read like elegance. It could read rough, and it has a built-in rhythm, and that rhythm is fundamental. And you can't, if the rhythm is not there, you can't insert it later. You can't in a revision put in the rhythm. The rhythm has to be almost as natural to the prose as breath is to a body.
Someone asks, how did you come to write about Thomas Mann? What inspired you on this, in this and in your eventual book?
I had read the books in my late teens, early 20s. Oddly enough, The Magic Mountain was hugely fashionable. It was like the David Foster Wallace of the 1970s, if you were Irish or English. And books were terribly well published, cheap Penguin editions. And I loved the books, but I didn't think anything. I just thought, I suppose at that time, I thought that writers just wrote books. I didn't realize how much felt life, how much experience went into a book, that it wasn't merely a literary exercise in making the book. And nothing much was known about Thomas Mann really until his diaries were published. 25 years after his death, he died in 55. And then biographers got to work. And at one stage in 1995, 3 biographies of him came out in the same period, and I reviewed them at enormous length. And I was fascinated by the amount of his life that he had revealed and the amount he had concealed, and that the whole day was spent revealing and concealing. And it gave the novels for me a huge new energy to know about the life that had gone into them, especially Buddenbrooks, especially, well, all of them really, all of the books that I liked best. And I became interested in the ambiguities. I became interested in how he was ready to change. I became interested in how he could not be easily pinned down. And it was not merely on his sexuality, but on his political life, and indeed on his whole personal aura seemed to me to be a mask for something much wilder that was going on within him that he really learned to disguise.
Was all his writing just sort of a grand act of the sublimation of desire into?
I don't think you can say that. I think you always have to leave room for artistry, that there were times when something fascinated him enough. And for example, the creation of the figure of Tony Buddenbrooks, the aunt in that novel, you can't say, oh, that's sublimation, or that's, Thomas Mann really trying to be, it's the sort of female side of him. I think all that, I think he was working, and this figure began to fascinate him, and he was an artist, and he began to make this work as for the reader. But there are other times, I think in the Magic Mountain seems to me so filled with secret sexual feelings and all sorts of sort of sweaty undercurrents that are erotic, whereas on the surface, everyone is going down a corridor or going to treatment or having debates about the future, but that underneath there's something else going on. I think the Magic Mountain really benefits from knowing about Thomas Mann. And in fact, his wife was in a sanatorium in Davos, and he did go there to visit her. So the novel begins with autobiography. It doesn't, but it never ends there. So I think that his work was nourished by that sublimation, but it's not as though that is the only explanation for his work. I think that would be a really sort of crude way of reading him. But nonetheless, you need to include it in any assessment of him.
Yeah, you do that so well, not with regard to his work per se, but the scene where he goes to the store in New York to buy the albums, the records, after he's seen all these men in the street in New York who arouse his desire, and he decides to channel it into purchasing classical music. Sort of
Yes.
What you're talking about. It's just a wonderful scene that you create, and then the store owner, well, I don't want to blow it for people, but.
Well, you see, the store owner, first of all, tells them that America's going into the war. I know this because people are really stocking up with records in a way that they didn't before. Business is amazing, and there's got to be a reason for it. And but then Thomas Mann starts to flirt with him, and he starts to flirt with his assistant. And so the three of them, he's buying records, and he's asking for various things, and they know everything about classical music, so they have something in common to enthuse about. But actually what's really going on is that Thomas Mann is away from his wife, he's away from his family, he's away from Princeton, and he's suddenly almost free to flirt, and he's really, oh my God, if any of the others saw what he's doing now, and they seem to like him in the store, and so it's a funny moment where you can see him in a totally new guise. I think in any novel, you need to be able to make the character change to move out of character, to do something unusual, or otherwise you're just stuck with a single characteristic of a character. And none of us has that. None of us has a single characteristic. We have more than one. So how come in fiction, you often find, oh my God, I wish this good person would do something really bad. Or I wish this greedy person would become generous. And in the case of Mann, I wish this buttoned up person would just simply, open his coat, and that's what he does in the record shop.
That's wonderful scene, wonderful scene. Somebody asks, since the magician idea seems to play a small part of his life, why did you decide to use that as the title?
Well, he wrote a story called Mario and the Magician. He wrote a novel called The Magic Mountain. His children went on calling him the magician all his life. And in German, that's Zauberer. So they would just put Z in a letter, meaning our father. But it's also an ironic title. I mean, it's like with the Henry James, it's called The Master. He didn't feel like a master a lot of the time, as he was solitary and lonely when he was writing those magisterial books, but it didn't feel like that on the day. So the title is ironic. I mean, he wasn't a magician, but in a way the children were, in continuing to use it, where there was a sort of joke going on, this sort of timid figure of our father, we call him the magician. So it's there for all those reasons.
I just want to say the scenes with the kids, regardless of when they're happening throughout the book, are so wonderfully witty and vital. I had so much fun reading those scenes. They really came alive. These are brilliant, obviously.
They're there for really good reasons, in that if you try and register what German dialogue might have been like in German fiction at the early 20th century, you could have very long, people saying very long things in a very serious, scholarly German way. And what I wanted to do was to make the dialogue super modern. They're constantly interrupting each other. It's like figures from Hemingway almost, in the way that they talk in clipped sentences. But I just wanted to do that because the alternative was really so disastrous. You should see some of the drafts of this book and just how bad some of those scenes were, where they would try and talk in long sentences with the verb at the end, and then actually this has to change. This is outlandishly bad. And, it's a bad parody of something I don't even really understand properly, which is, how people might have spoken then. How can we tell? And so it's, I decided to bring it up to date.
Oh, it works so well. It's wonderful. Somebody asked, what happened to Thomas Mann's other brothers and sisters and his mother, ultimately?
His mother moves to this place in Bavaria for her old age, and of course, is deeply affected by the inflation because all of her savings are sort of worthless. And she dies in the early 1920s. Both of his sisters committed suicide. One because of some romantic attachment that wasn't working. She did this before the First World War. The other sister was very badly affected again by inflation and had taken to morphine. And it was a disaster. The inflation, it's hard to understand what that was like. Simply people had literally, who thought they had pensions, had literally no money. And the younger brother wrote a terrible book called We Were Five, because no one had ever heard of Victor. And his book called We Were Five, the others used to laugh at it. But he stayed in Germany. His wife was a rather more enthusiastic supporter of Hitler than he was, but nonetheless, he was not a dissident in Germany, and he dies in the 1950s. But there's very little. There's very little contact between the older brothers and Victor. Victor is a sort of he's the last of the family, and they don't really bond with him ever. That's what happens.
You mentioned Hitler, and there was something I was curious about, whether there's a scene in the novel where Mann he's preparing to meet Roosevelt for the first time. He's trying to figure out if he should talk about the plight of the Jews. And he decides against it because he doesn't want to be seen as taking any particular side, if I've got that right. And
well, it's not any particular side as much as that he's not going to hector the president, that he's not going to come in and seem to be troublesome and demanding things, that he needs to forge a relationship with him. What he does later on is that he gets Eleanor on her own, and he has Heinrich, his brother's first wife, is Jewish, and she does spend the war in the concentration camp. In a most horrific experience. It's horrific for Heinrich because he realizes that he's left her behind. And this is 1941 when Thomas tries to talk to Eleanor Roosevelt, and it's not going to be possible to get someone out of Prague with a visa with her daughter and into America by that time. It's just not going to be able to happen. So there is I think the scene with Roosevelt is more that he just doesn't want to seem to be this, everyone is looking for something from Roosevelt, and he realizes his job is to do something softer. And but I mean, it isn't as though he isn't. I mean, in his broadcast, for example, he raises the matter of the danger that Jewish people are in, and then he raises the matter of the concentration camps. So it isn't as though he's sort of timid on that. Really, he isn't. But he has to be strategic with Roosevelt.
Was that all from the diaries, or was that?
You can see it from the broadcast how much he does it, but you can also see from diaries and other things that he isn't as though he's very careful in his relationship with Roosevelt, and he trusts Roosevelt, but he also knows the pressures Roosevelt is under. He's under huge pressures because people don't want a huge influx of German refugees. I mean, like America is a funny country. It's open and then it's closed. It's one faction, like the president wants one thing and Congress wants another. So Roosevelt is being very careful, and Mann understands why he's being very careful. But I think that nonetheless, the closing of America to Jewish refugees is something, I think, it's very sad when you look at it, back at it. But what I'm trying to do is imagine it at the time as something was being done for political reasons because of the levels of opposition from someone like Lindbergh, for example, that Roosevelt was under. So you have to think about it as what it was like that year rather than what it looks like in retrospect. In retrospect, it looks awful.
Well, I didn't want to end on an awful note, and it's not, because the novel is wonderful. It's so witty, and there's a whole cascade of thank yous and beautiful reading, and thank you for your wonderful talk coming in through the Q&A. So Colm, thank you so much. I'm sorry we couldn't do this in person, okay. But, next year in Philadelphia.
Next year in Philadelphia, yeah. Okay.
All right, good luck with the book.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time and the beautiful words.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.